Welcome to session 5. This session, we're returning to a topic that we started in the first session, which is of more of the spiritualist variety. So in the sessions 2 through 4, we covered more of the Abrahamic realm of things, whereas this time, we're kind of returning to more of the word I always use for it is the wooey aspects of religion, especially in regards to before religion was religion. If you look up where all religions originate, it always harkens back to this concept of animism. And animism and shamanism, by extension, as we'll see throughout, the best way to define it is the belief that everything is spirit. Everything is spirit. Everything is alive. Everything is conscious. Everything is mutually participatory, and a certain element of self-governing and a certain element of immortality, immortal. Shamanism and animism are not purely in the past. It is still practiced. It has always been practiced. It has always been around throughout all the ages that we will discuss in the ancient world, throughout all of human history, the best way of putting it. So really this topic is going to span, as much as I can talk about it, it's going to span all ages. Mostly what I want to establish with this talk is the variety of animism and shamanism, and give us an idea of what it means and how it's diversified. So I feel like it's worth pointing out that shamanism is not dogmatic, and there is no prophet. There is no sacred text, set of rules. Many people who practice shamanism identify as Catholics, as Buddhists, any variety, really. It is not exclusive. So the kind of other central philosophy that I want to mention is the statement that human beings are seen as a part of nature and not something other than nature. And this would come into debate in many religions, especially when we mentioned Gnosticism being something very different than this world, being a fluke in this world, only being here by a grand accident. This is quite the opposite. We are it. It is us. So the goal by all these beliefs, more or less, is to live in harmony with the natural environment, to not go against the groove of things. It would be viewed, civilization, especially modern technocratic civilization, would be viewed as a sort of cancerous entity that has spread itself all over the surface of the earth. And that this is something that needs to be returned, that we need to return to spirit. Ask any shaman in the modern day what the modern day needs, and this is exactly what they'd say. We need to remember. We need to remember. So the act of a shaman, in its most general definition, is a healer, one who heals. Now, there's many ways that it's gone about, but it's always flavored in ritual magic, and I suppose you could call it clairvoyant knowledge. In the earliest days, so we're talking kind of prehistory, the shamans would be the ones to assist in the hunt, the ones to point out where the hunt should be, and also to make sure that none of the species goes hunted into extinction. They most notably, and this is a good distinction to make too, they are inherent in a community. They are an integral part of a community now. In the modern age, we have many people who are self-identifying shamans, but the true distinction here is that they need a community around them to truly embody the archetypal shaman. And their responsibilities by modern terms would sort of be like uh, a priest, would sort of be like a mediator or a lawyer, we could just as easily say counselor, uh, and of course a doctor. And as we'll see too, this is what would eventually be referred to as a witch doctor, very coercively. So whether in the ancient world or in the modern, shamans would be the ones to conduct rituals and ceremonies. So if we had a birth, a shaman would be there. If we had a marriage, a shaman would be there. If someone in the tribe was coming of age, the shaman would be there. Funerals, certain peak times of the year for harvesting, a shaman would be integral to these events. And if they weren't, this would be viewed as a bad omen, a thing of bad fortune. The other flavor that is inherent in shamanism is music. Now, it's not two things here: music, and we'll get into later, psychedelics. And these things are not, sometimes they're more true and sometimes they're less true. Not all shamans take psychedelics, and not all shamans necessarily perform ceremonies through music. So there's variance in those two key factors. Both of these things solicit visionary experiences. That's the idea. And the shaman works through visionary experiences. They are basically a master trance worker. They are masters of the mind, and of the experience of extraordinary states, which gives them a very still and poised presence in front of anybody. So when it comes to the music, at least, what we'd see most generally is a drum, which has been forged in every part very intentfully, or a rattle, which again has been formed very intentionally, whether it's using smudging equipment for blessing people with the smoke of sacred herbs. They would use a shell. All the things that are being used are of the natural order, and quite intentfully so. I'll mention this more later, but in my work with a Lakota medicine man, a big part of even being introduced into an anipe, which is a sweat lodge, is that you have to understand why everything is where it is, what animal skins are being used, how they were treated, what herbs they're using, what specific use they have, why we put food in front of I believe it was a horse's skull, and why we don't eat until this time. Every part of the ritual, down to what words you would say when you would enter the anipe, has a purpose and has a reason for it. So we're talking about a very intentful act, very symbolic acts. That's another trademark of the shaman. So what I want to start getting into, that just served as a general basis, but what I want to start getting into is all the different ways that shamanism has been expressed around the world. And of course, we might have an assumption, especially when I bring up the word animism, that a lot of this is found in Africa. That's usually where the association of the word animism is. People might think of things like voodoo, for instance. Uh, So a lot of these names, well beyond me just speaking of Africa, I'm likely going to mispronounce. So of course, forgive me. I'm not familiar with a lot of these beyond just reading them. But in Southern Africa, it's the Sangomas, and they're traditional healers of the Swazi and the Zulu people, and there's a few others as well. Um, Again, just as I mentioned before, they're community leaders. They have a specific flair for divination, predicting the future, clairvoyance, as I mentioned, and herbal medicine. So for them, they play more of the part, as I understand it, as specifically healers, medicine men, which is generally a term more reserved for Native Americans, which we'll get to. So the Sangomas will take all means, herbs, animal parts, natural objects, rocks, create and grind them perhaps, and create special medicines that they call muti. Um, so this is that medicine man. And in kind of more anthropological and scientific research done on the work of shamans, they're generally convinced that the shamans work through placebo in confirmation bias, that these herbs are in fact useless, but it's the whole charade of what they do that convinces people of its medicinal properties. And you can hear many testimonies as to it working for people, but the question is, how does it work? Is there something truly other that we don't understand that's going on, or is it simply something that's mental? And of course, this sort of question to the shaman would just be that it doesn't matter, it works. So the Sangomas is Southern Africa. West Africa, I think, is a different tradition practiced by the Fang and Mitsogo tribes, the indigenous people there. And this is for the Bantu people, and mind you, there's a lot of names I'm going to pass through here. The sect here is more of a religion, and it's the Bwiti. You can find them in Gabon, Cameroon, Congo, and Zaire. So the Bwiti is translated as dead ancestor, which I know that sounds a little ominous. Now, this is more of a religion, as I said, because it's more of a something that the locals, I think even the nations have designated as a national religion. And I think it's Iboga. They use what's called an ethnogenic sacrament, which is a psychedelic. It's a perennial jungle shrub, and they harvest its orange fruit, which produces psychoactive effects. The inner root of this is producing the psychoactive effects. And of course, as with many shamans, they use a complex initiation ceremony. And this is specifically used for men coming of age. So to pass through from being an adolescent into a man is to partake in this hallucinogenic ceremony. And something that we'll mention later, of course, too, is I feel like everybody has a general understanding or a familiarity with the concept of a spirit quest as it's done by the natives, where they would go out and find their spirit animals. And this is something that we discuss, but this is something that is a classic trope of shamanism and animism is this spiritual journey that moves one into adulthood. And mind you, it's happening today, and it is flavored our past. This is, again, the original spirituality as it's always been in this world. So we have to give it credit where it's due. Now, one that I find particularly interesting in Africa is the Yoruba people. And they're interesting because they have an actual element of monotheism. I'm going to try to say this. Uh, Alodumare. This would be the god of creation and existence, the force that created everything. The Yoruba had very uncanny knowledge of the stars. They knew of stars that were not capable of being seen by the naked eye in Orion's belt. And when asked on how they know these things, it's through the shamans. How can you know these scientific discoveries? And they knew a good lot more than what should have been, by scientific measures, should have been capable to them. So I bring this up for two reasons. For one, we see two strange distinctions here in the ancient past. The Yoruba faith has existed for a long time. And here we see something that's different than a lot of other beliefs across the world. And that is, again, this concept of one God or one ruling force that is unique in the ancient world and shows a diversification from what we've seen elsewhere. And also, this Yoruba belief implies a reincarnation, a tunwa, as they call it. And usually the children would bear qualities of their grandparents. This is something that's also been studied when I was mentioning in our spiritualism talk. The fact that they believe it seems to make it ever more true. So that was just something I wanted to throw in there because it's something that I'll want to bring up later in how different religions bloomed out of shamanism, being this OG religion. Now in Europe, I'm not going to talk about this much. We all know what it divulged into. Eventually, it came in Proto-Indo-European into Europe, and it eventually moved into all different forms of paganism. That much is clear. That much is just classic history. But something that's unique is, of course, all the cave drawings that they found, and the ones in France are particularly interesting, that predate what they associate humans to be around, basically. And these specific people of Europe had this strange practice. They speculate, at least, that they would crack open the skulls of animals and basically eat up their brain matter. And this would result in ingesting different chemicals that we are familiar with nowadays, dopamine, serotonin, adrenaline. And in eating this would have been thrown into, whether voluntarily or not, a psychoactive experience. This would have made them trip out, basically. So they learned of altered states through the consumption of animal brains, which we see some depictions of that across the world. And also I think it was like Raiders of the Lost Ark. And this is the origin of the bear cave cults, as they've been called, which is kind of ominous. And mind you, many shamanic traditions across the world have a very special place for the bear in their kind of canon. Now, we get the word shaman from a specific types of shaman. that live in Siberia. So we're talking Russia here. And they've always been there, mind you. And they extend all the way to Mongolia as well. So shamans are a type of people. And there are many different words across all these cultures that I'm mentioning for shaman. But this is the one that English has brought in because of a study of an anthropologist of these people that popularized this to the modern world. So the shamans in Siberia serve as an intermediary between the spiritual and the human world. They are viewed as kind of not necessarily gatekeepers, but as travelers. And they help people through the use of spirits or helper spirits, which we'll find many different words for this too: power animals, spirit animals, guardian angels is a little bit more of a classical term for it. And these spirits that they utilize come in many shapes and forms. It doesn't necessarily have to be animals, but oftentimes in shamanic tribes, it is animals that really take the helm. But of course, plants have spirits too. As mentioned, everything has spirits. So to these shamans, the actual shamans of Siberia, the key to all their rituals and ceremonies is this effort to transcend normal states of consciousness. So this is kind of where we're picking up, and I brought this up when in the Mithras talk last week. I'm going to bring up Santa Claus again because I mentioned that we inherited a lot of the symbology from Mithraism, but when it comes to this concept of magic, that Santa is magic, and the concept of reindeer, that he rides on reindeer, and the association with Christmas time and cider, this is where I have to bring up that oftentimes in many traditions of shamanism, the Animita muscaria, or the fly agaric mushroom, is their quintessential drug in Europe and Siberia. And so in order to ingest this drug, you couldn't eat it straight out. That would be poisonous. What you need is to feed it to a reindeer. Insert reindeer here. And you harvest its urine and you drink that urine, and that will produce the psychoactive effect. Now, as with many questions as to how the shamans know this, and of course, we might be implied to think that, through time, they just kind of screwed around with things, and then they eventually realized through all their experimenting of drinking piss in the ancient past, where actually they claim that they know this because they asked the spirits themselves. The spirits instructed them. And they all have different names for these types of spirits. But this is yet again where we get the holly jolly magic association with Christmas, because these would be the times of harvest and using the reindeer to create the cider. And here comes the shaman up from the hill after he's ridden the reindeer to bring us the joy. So anyway, I want to move on with that. But I did want to mention that's always been a topic of fascination for me. Of course, the other something that I'll mention later is that the view of the shamanic people, not just these shamans, but all shamans, is that there is a connection between the cosmos and the nature that we experience here. And in that way, oftentimes, for us, at least in our kind of scientism understanding of the world, the cosmos seems like a completely different entity. Like as soon as you escape Earth and you move into the vacuum, things are very lawless, There's all these places of extreme temperatures and extreme coldness and radiation and so forth. But to the shamanic worldview, this is all nature spirits. This is all nature work. There isn't this kind of the stars beyond are just as much a home to us as the planet is. And mind you, I'm being a little simplifying here, but it's this, the flavor of this belief is unification. It's all a part of the same thing. There is no differences. We're not in some little ball. So before I get too much into the philosophy, because I'm saving that for the end, I wanted to mention that in Japan, a lot of people don't know this, but there's the Shinto people. And the Shinto predate the Japanese. This is definitely an interesting thing to look into. There are people in Japan before the Japanese, what we call Japanese, come to live in Japan, which there's a lot of history behind this, but they look different and they have different beliefs, and it is called the Shinto. And that Shinto translates into the way of the gods. So the Shintos believe in kami, which is spirits, which inhabit landscapes and living things. So again, this predating culture believes in something very similar to what we see, again, animism, shamanism, in something very similar that we see across the world still being practiced, and the beliefs of the ancient past. And these Shinto are completely distinct from cultural and religious influences from China, from the greater Asiatic faiths. The other, we'd call the people in particular the Ainu, Ainu, Ainu. And of course, they worshipped bears. They had several archetypal animals for their culture. And as I mentioned before, these people share a common ancestry with the Mongolians and with the Siberian shamans, as I was mentioning. They all have a common ancestry. The shamanism here in Russia, in Siberia, and Mongolia is referred to as Tengerism. Tengerism. So interesting little tidbit there too, because it kind of defies some of our classic understanding of how history has unfolded. Now I want to spend, and mind you, my whole talk definitely isn't going to be setting geographics, but one that I especially wanted to mention here is Tibet. And it's the Bonpo Shamanism. This is what predates Tibetan Buddhism, which, of course, when people think of Tibet, they think of the monks. Now, the Bonpo did something very different. This is going to kind of help to inform us on how religions spread from shamanism. They're a great example of this. In Bonpo, there is what we would refer to as specialized shamans. And we see this in some cultures, but not all. But certain types of shamans do certain types of work. So there's this concept, Ramchis, which is, get this, I'm going to read this verbatim. You are projecting out of the physical body through the aperture on top of the skull into one of three symbolic mirrors arranged in an altar. These three mirrors are gateways to the worlds of Laha, celestial spirits, of the world of Tsen, which is earth and mountain spirits, and the world of Lu, which is the subterranean water spirits. So this is getting a lot more wooey. It's getting a lot more kind of new agey sounding, or maybe occultic sounding. There are three zones in the Bonpo cosmology, and that is the sky, the earth, and the underworld. So what is above, what is here, and what is below, which also sounds pretty occult-like. Now, a specialized shaman in this tradition would leave their physical body and call forth a Pao, which is a spirit, and the shaman's vacated inert body would be utilized by the Pao. So this is exactly what I was talking about in the spiritualism session. They are doing mediumship. The shamans are doing mediumship. They are embodying the spirits of things that perhaps of people who are dead, or perhaps of completely other spirits. Um, and this is to say that the spiritualism movement really wasn't something unique. You know, we think of this kind of stuff as somewhat new agey, you know, the astral plane, but it's more of kind of like what Terence McKenna called it, the archaic revival, where these things seem new because of how far away from them we've moved as a people. So the guides inhabiting the body of the shaman would offer advice. So you ask, you know, how did the shamanic people of Siberia know to feed the mushroom to the reindeer? And this would be their answer, that the shamans used mediumship to ask nature what to do. Whew. They had other types of shamans. Nakpa, that were more of a kind of exorcist. So in this way, when negative spirits, so the way they viewed it is that certain spirits would become offended or upset, and that they would need to be kind of mediated. And again, the shaman is mediating between the physical and the spiritual. So in the same way that a shaman would work with somebody who's going through problems in their tribe, they would also be mediating with offended spirits to make sure that they don't lash out in some sort of way. And certain tribes, if you asked if shamans believe in a soul, they wouldn't say, their answer would be, how many? Because the idea is that people can fracture their souls, that their souls exist in other places, and that sickness is viewed as a need to retrieve where a portion of your soul has been left. And that would be the work of the shaman, would be to move into a trance to retrieve your soul and bring it back from one of these realms, and to fix you by this kind of work. And of course, modern medicine would be more like, okay, just cut them open, you know, cut that thing out and medicate them. But this work was of the spiritual plane, which they would view as where these diseases and where these cancers actually originate from. And so they view what modern medicine is doing as dealing with the symptom of the symptom and not getting to the root cause. You know, if a cancer metastasizes, it will continually return, right? So what is causing that cancer to begin with? And while we could blame physical things, we can't leave out the mind over matter aspect, or that these things might originate in other places. And this kind of drags us into other new age topics too, considering that Reiki has a lot to do with that the first disorder of your body manifests in the auric field around you, in the etheric body around you. And then if it's allowed to continue, it will penetrate your manifestation, your body, and then become a physical ailment or disease. So the work of the shaman is to not only deal with what's wrong now, but also to prevent what is to come, to keep all things well. And their other general idea for why these sicknesses come about is the philosophy that we jump out of the natural rhythm. If each and every person was to be a part of the natural rhythm, to truly go with the flow, or go with the Tao as it's referred to, then there wouldn't be any illness and there wouldn't be any strife to contend with. So if a tribe is utterly right in their emotions, in their egos, in their self-reflections, then none of these diseases would come about. And what we're seeing nowadays, of course, you know, with this coronavirus, as it's been called, is that the places that have been most affected are the cities, and that seems like a completely logical leap for the shamans, because these are the places that are the furthest out of the natural rhythm. The people who are nearest to the natural rhythm would be the ones that do not have to worry about this illness. Nobody who is truly aligned or balanced needs to worry about this. And to those places that are collectively outside of the grain of where we should be, kind of forsaking the natural order and who we naturally are the ones to be afraid of such a thing. That is the shamanic approach to this. I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but so when we hear of parapsychologists talking about the subtle energy field around our bodies, or when I was mentioning Kirlian photography capturing the aura around us, this might seem strange to us, but to the shamans, this is like, yeah, you know, what do you think we've been saying forever? So if a shaman does not recapture parts of the soul that are missing, this is what they would blame on this is how natural death would occur. Mind you, there are other reasons for death, and we're going to talk about that too. So I find the Bonpo extra fascinating because they did this thing where a long time ago they hid what they called termas, or the hidden treasure texts, and these termas were hidden because they came to believe that the world was not ready for what they had to say, which is kind of like what the Gnostics did when they buried the Nag Hammadi library. And so eventually they did resurface, and that they are being observed. And mind you, just for context too, the Bonpo shamans and the Tibetan Buddhist monks do cohabitate. They are not at odds with each other. Bonpo shamanism has taken a kind of back seat in comparison to its historical standing, but it's still there. Now, when I bring up these termas, the one that's the kind of one that people might be familiar with is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And why I find this so fascinating is through shamanic journeying and through a collection of people in the ancient past, through embodying spirits or whatever means that they used, they managed to chart an entire cosmology, all dimensions, the places that they would travel in the psychoactive experiences. So to those that have had experience with plant medicine, these shamans in particular would believe that there are places you go. There is a sort of map to show where you were, and that they attempted, you know, talk about the work of a geographer is crazy enough to make a terrestrial map, but just try to wrap your mind around that they were attempting to map the multi-dimensional, where you would go in your dreams, where you would go in lucid dreams, where you would go in all these different kind of psychoactive effects. It was not subjective to them. They interpreted where we would go in hallucinatory experiences as objective places, as objective phenomena. So in regards to the topic of how religion seemed to spring out of the collective belief of animism and shamanism, this is a great example that they tried to come together to push for more answers beyond what their beliefs facilitated. And I think this is ultimately why humanity has split off in its beliefs so variously and with great complexity, is because of this ever-growing seeking. And mind you, not all people ever felt the need. You know, plenty of tribes have remained the same way for we don't know how long, but certain of us in human history felt the need to keep pushing this agenda, to keep inquiring more, supposedly beyond our means. And so the Bonpo, in this way, showing their efforts, uh, would distinguish themselves from other shamans in this belief of theirs. Not to mention that there are cultural influences too, how the land replies or what the spirits say to all these shamans across the world, and how they're approaching said spirits would have perhaps changed the ways that they would conceive of the world. And also, there's a discussion of language, which adds a whole nother complexity to this. Um, so before I talk just straight philosophy some more, I have to address like the elephant in the room, and that's because it's Native Americans. I mean, this is animism. This is shamanism. You find all over um, a good complexity from the different tribes of the states. Something that's interesting too is a lot of these tribes would embody a kind of androgynousness or a worship of the hermaphroditic. And the idea is that shamans would oftentimes, if they were men, they would dress as women. And if they were women, they would dress as men, or they would try to embody the powers of both genders, because they found that we are less powerful if you are purely embodying one archetype, masculine or feminine. So oftentimes we see in these cultures that there is a place for what we would call homosexual individuals. They would be en route to becoming shamans in these ancient cultures, or other times where we see that there is as many as I think 6 or 7 genders, or 5. There is the masculine masculine, the feminine masculine, the hermaphroditic, the masculine feminine, and the feminine feminine. And all of this was a part of their culture because it was tied to the shamanic. Now, in the Native American tradition, there is this healer aspect. There is a community leader aspect. There is a therapist aspect. But the big one for them is that they are a divine spiritual communicator. They are supposed to inform the people of what is going on in this whole other sector of things. And to the natives, this was within their belief. They wanted to know. And the particular trait of the medicine men of Native America is that their services would oftentimes be of barter for things like corn or maize, cacao, coffee, sacred crops, but most notably tobacco. Now, in the Lakota tradition, as I'm most familiar, the tobacco was a general currency with nature. If you were to harvest an animal, or if you were to harvest a plant, you would give it tobacco, because you never take without giving. There is a reciprocation in every exchange. And that's why the white man, the colonializers, seemed so disrespectful and alien to these shamans, because it was this clear cutting and this pure taking that highly disturbed them. So where do I want to leave off with this? The nature of peyote or peyote and the Nahuatl people, this is something that's generally well known. It's the small buttons on premature sprouts of a cactus, which have hallucinatory effects, mystical visions accordingly. We see this as a giant staple of these cultures. They make art out of it. It's a part of their ceremonies. To them and other tribal groups, the use of peyote is imperative in maintaining the balance between the spiritual and human nature. And again, I just want to preface too that not all these cultures believe in using hallucinogens, but in our Native Americans, this is a pretty commonplace. And of course, I would be remiss to not mention ayahuasca as well. And this is another fascinating tale of how do you know about this? Because you need 2 different plants, one plant is the hallucinatory nature, and then the other plant is your means of digesting it, and for it to even not poison you in your stomach. And how you cook it makes it the perfect kind of brew. And of course, scientists would be like, well, how do you know this? And then they would say, the spirits told us. And the ayahuasca ceremony is nothing to shake a stick at. You can connect with the dead. You can relive past life memories. You can experience entities beyond human comprehension, or what they contemporaneously call DMT entities. And it's horrifying. It's a horrifying experience. This is usually you would be vomiting. You would be in an utterly alien world. You're experiencing emotions to degrees that you would never believe possible. It is viewed as facing your fears. It is something for death and rebirth, which is something I want to start to talk on. So the use of all these hallucinogenics and transitory experiences around the world, especially hallucinogenics, is this concept of allowing nature to do with you what it will, because this is you admitting to it or trusting in it to provide, to show you what it needs to show you. And so it's not that there shouldn't be fear, but it's not the type of fear that you might think. There is anticipation, sure, but you trust nature. So you would trust that even if you were to die, that this is not something horrible. And even though you are going to experience horrible things, this is a part of that trust. It's showing your commitment, which is sacred. So before I get on about that a little bit more, it's always a topic in any of these that I want to kind of mention the afterlife, because that's the kind of quintessential question of all religions and all spiritualities, is what it has to say about the afterlife. And in shamanism, there is no death. And that's not to say that they aren't aware that people die. It's just to say that they don't believe it's an end. An end is the concept of the Western mind. They look out into nature and they see that nothing ends, that everything moves into other things. Yes, a tree decomposes, and then the tree assists the fungi, or assists the worms, or assists all these other things, and nothing leaves. So we, in their mind, live forever. Our soul is immortal. If this place exists, we exist because we are this place. Now, they do acknowledge, of course, that the act of physical death that we will all undertake is a dramatic transition, which is dramatic because it includes us leaving the physical vessel. And this is also dramatic because we're moving into something that we are not familiar with, or at least right now we're not familiar with it. And the space that we occupy, and our experience of this space that we occupy, is eternal. Like, we do move into the next realm or another way of seeing it, but it's still nature. So it's a lot for us to dissect, being in our indoctrination of the Western world. It's a lot for us to understand and to be able to ask the right questions. We can ask a lot of questions about what they mean, but we have to understand where they're coming from. So the fear and anxiety of death is the fear of the body. They don't view it as the fear of the soul. And again, the end seems absurd to them, the idea of the end. And they actually have a kind of welcoming of death because they assume or understand or believe or know that upon death, the mystery will be revealed or will be lived in or you will be subsumed in the mystery. So there's this acknowledgement of the unknown, that there are greater things, and that we find it a blessing to move into that, to be able to see it, to move beyond the blinders of being inhabited in a body. And to the shamans, who are people who understandably use out of body experiences regularly and have thrown themselves to the gutter of death over and over and over again, to the point where they have become so familiar with the process that they have nothing else to say other than it moves, it goes on. um, hmm. So before talking about that too much more, I want to touch on this fact too, that something I haven't mentioned is that the shamans are also associated with the trickster. And we might think that, that's a little coercive, because it might make it seem like they are trying to get a leg up or trying to be manipulative, which many people would assume of them via the name witch doctors and so forth, uh, uh, divine healers. But the trickster essence is that they have a kind of guru-esque way of answering questions. If you ask them philosophical questions, then they'll kind of have this way of spinning you around in the ways that the gurus of India do. Um, it's that kind of Brahmin essence. uh, I thought, hey, shaman, I thought I saw you earlier collecting herbs, but I understand that somebody else saw that you were meditating all day. And the shaman will say, yes, you did see me. I took the body of an eagle and was collecting the herbs while I was here. My body was here meditating. And so there's all sorts of these ways of not just messing with people. And again, it's kind of hard for us to understand through our context, but at least in tarot, the very archetypal essence of the Godhead, or the most enlightened one, is the fool. And in that way, the fool doesn't really know anything. They just are a part of it. They are it. They are involved in the subliminal nature of all things. They aren't a priest because they aren't trying to inflate their egos. They're not trying to profess. All they're doing is living. And that's why they would call it in tarot the fool, but in another way, we could call them the trickster or the jester, or what is in the deck as the joker. And the joke is the advice of the shaman. Okay, where do I go when I die? Well, where have you always been? Or the joke sounds something like, everything is certainly uncertain, or the only thing that doesn't change is change itself. When we get down to the bare bones truth of reality, it sounds like a joke. And this is what they've called the Cosmic Giggle. So before I close up too, I want to just kind of make this a little bit more personable too, and kind of dissect some of the things that I've brought up. The standard shamanic understanding of the world, and I briefly mentioned it, is that there is the higher realm. By higher, it doesn't mean transcendent. It just means it's up there. There is where we are, and there is the lower realm. In a shamanic journey, if you're moved into a trance, you go into the lower realm to find your power animal, or your spirit animal, or the spirit that will help you. The lower realm takes the form of a fey land, or a fairy land, or an earth that was never touched by man's hand, an abundance of natural beauty, infinitum. And this is where you'd go to find your power animal. And say you find your power animal, and you do this either through a deep trance experience, or you do this through a hallucinogenic experience that you are given when you move from adolescence into adulthood. So the spiritual journey to find your power animal wasn't necessarily a journey physically. They wouldn't go physically and starve out in the desert. I mean, maybe, but more often than not, we can assume that this was an inward journey, not an outward journey. So when the natives were talking about this and trying to explain this to, the colonializers, they would assume that they would just go out physically. But no, this was an inner journey, and in the lower realm you find your spirit animal, and this is how they would get their name. So say if your spirit animal was a deer, you would dance the way of the deer. The music that you would play, you would dance out your spirit animal so that you can embody it, and this is a way of feeding the essence of that spirit, which makes it want to assist you. We can see how this concept divulged into the world and what we associate with primitive beliefs, that we have to sacrifice a woman to the god of the volcano or the god will kill us all. And so this is where we get it. Like in the Greek pantheism, you had to make sacrifices to the gods. So this was a kind of movement from this original understanding of spirits into what we associate with the ancient world. This kind of what we assume frivolous actions of needlessly killing people, or people needlessly killing themselves, like what people see in the Aztec culture, for nothing, for no scientific reason, for no logic. This was an acknowledgement of this other world, of which the Western society seems utterly blind to. And there's reasons for that, but that's a whole nother talk alone. Now, my experience with the Lakota, at least, was that, oh gosh, I don't want to go. Well, this is a lot of what I'm telling you too, but I'll get to that in a second. But the upper realm is the realm of the ascended masters, or of the moved on shamans. So there is no hell, and there is no heaven as we've conceded. There's no duality. All is nature. But the upper realm is the place of, I suppose you could say, more of the intellect and more of mind. And this is where you would go to seek larger answers. Whereas you could ask the spirits of the lower realm, the animal spirits and the plant spirits, of things that are more pertinent to this world. So what plants should we get for harvest? When should we hunt? These kind of, what weather will come? And this is how the shaman would be able to know all these things, by speaking with them, by being friends with them effectively. Now, what I was trying to get to is that my experience with the Lakota was that they would invite everybody in. We had Buddhists, we had Christians. We would come to honor all the ceremonies of the medicine man, say what we were supposed to say when we were supposed to say it, do the actions as we were supposed to do, move into the Inipe, which was the sweat lodge, which was all covered in animal skins, have hot rocks that had been prepared from the day before over a fire, pour the water over the fire. The water had also been sanctified, start to sweat it out. Drums would be in there. Ancient songs that have always been sung would be sung. And to the natives, they had the concept of the grandmother, or the kind of beginning spirit that brought gifts to all the different tribes of the Native Americans. And to the Lakota, the grandmother gifted them the drum. And to another culture, they would gift them the pipe. And each tribe had its own gift from the grandmother, and all the tribes were entrusted to kind of come together to share the gifts of the grandmother. Again, this seems kind of strange of us, but all the songs that we would sing were told to them by the grandmother. So this is the way that you call the spirits of the north. This is the way that you call the spirits of the south. This is the way that you cast a circle. And we would call all the spirits to join us in the Inipe to basically carry our good intentions for the world. No selfish prayers would ever be given. And in this space, through sweating, through music, through singing, you would have a psychoactive effect. You would be changed by these experiences, so much to the point where you could start to see the movement in the darkness, beyond the glimmer of the steaming rock. So the two last things I want to mention before I come to a close, because I've already taken up my full time here, is that there's this fascinating tale of shamans having competitions with each other in the old world, where they would hide things and tribes would come together. And the competition would be which shamans could know what the other shamans were hiding. So this would be how they would compete. This would be the way of sharpening each other's clairvoyance. And so, it's kind of like the what do I have in my hand kind of thing. And so they would just go back and forth and guess, or not guess, come to know, ask their inner guides. And if they could guess right, then it would continue. And whoever lost would lose a bet. You guys get this much of the corn or this much of the tobacco, right? So this would be their kind of like sports in a way, what we would understand as a sports. And I personally love that. It's a sharpening the shears of the mind and extrasensory ability. This is the old tale of how the shamans would compete. So the last point that I want to get to is one of the main things that I wanted to talk about when bringing all of this up, is how the religions blossomed from this, why we ever felt the need to separate from nature. And that's a very it's a curious question. I don't really have a good answer. I've got a lot of kind of ways to entertain it and to speculate about it, but it's a question of human history as to why we ever felt the need to go so heavy down this path that we're on now. And I think the modern age is a kind of existential crisis in all the Renaissance that of kind of trying to look back and understand the point where we went wrong. Why has everything turned so greedy, so needy, so exploitative, and where did we go wrong? And again, I want to say that, all the shamans have ever said is that we need to return to the ways of the spirit. We need to listen to the spirit. We need to believe, but more than anything, we need to trust in where we live and what we exist in our belongingness in this, that we are not a fluke, that we're not some strange entity that is a sort of abomination to this world. We're not a virus. We are here to protect it. We are here to be, to make a home for all things, to facilitate life. We have the capability of helping all animals, of helping all plants. That's what we're here to do, and that's what the shamans have been holding the torch of through time. And why we felt the need to step in another direction, I think, is rooted in our curiosity and in our aspirations for more and more and more. And I think that's what has ultimately led us to all sorts of various beliefs, all sorts of splittings, all sorts of different ways of conceptualizing the situation that we're in. And I'm not one to completely take the shamanic approach here. I'm not one to say that, of all of modern civilization is an abomination and, destroy it or anything like that. I believe that every faith, religion, idea of the world has its own credence and its own curiosity, and I want to delve into all of it equally. But I think that it's worth saying that a return to basics is a very strong lesson that we should take in modern society. And I think that I don't think that all this time that we've spent as civilization is a waste. I think that we need to learn how to marry what we've acquired through this time with what has always been there that we've seemed to neglect this whole time. And it's not about us discovering the truth as much as it's us remembering the truth. So I'll get off of my soapbox now. And I'll stop it with that.